is John Childs?
John Childs was England's most prolific hitman.
I've met a number of murderers, a number of gangsters, but John Childs was the most frightening man. If you wanted somebody bumped off, Childs would do it for cash.
Childs did in fact have antisocial personality disorder. He was a pathological liar.
Why confess to murders when nobody was ever found? The crimes that he claims to have committed are unproven.
It could well be that he had told a whole tissue of lies.
Anybody who's capable of committing those acts must be psychologically disturbed.
He's in prison for being a liar.
Is he lying? Is he telling the truth? We just don't know.
John Childs was born in the late 30s in North London. He doesn't seem to have been a particularly happy child. He left school as early as he could, drifted through a number of quite low-level jobs and eventually joined the army. Within about 9 months he was found guilty of burglary and he was dismissed from the army. And from then on he really drifted into various kinds of crime. He spent about 14 years in prison at various times for various offences. It was in prison that Charles met Terry Pinfold.
Terry Pinfold was an armed robber, but also, was trying to make his way, as a lot of these criminals do, with, a straight cover business.
When Charles came out of prison, he went to work with a factory that Pinfold had set up with Henry McKenny.
McKenny liked tinkering with diving equipment. He was a qualified diver, and in fact he was quite a successful engineer and had invented a unique diving valve that's still in use today.
All right.
McKenny was a notorious figure. He was someone who was involved in serious crime, armed robbers. He was known to the police.
I always remember McKenny because his eyes were the coldest eyes I'd ever seen. He just stared at you. And I'll never forget those eyes for as long as I live.
John Childs worked his way up, became involved in armed robbery, and this was an era of armed robbery.
In 1979, there was a very big armed robbery in Hertfordshire.
Of a Security Express van. It was an interesting robbery. It involved the robbers getting into the van, holding one of the guards hostage at gunpoint.
During the course of this morning, they loaded the van with about £500,000, with McKenny and Childs hiding inside the security wagon. And then when enough money was on board, the van was dumped, the guards were tied up, and the gang got away with the money.
The Hertfordshire police were investigating this, and they called in Detective Superintendent Tony Lundy. The major clue to this particular robbery was that there were some overalls that were dumped by the robbers.
The robbers had done a quick change into different clothing before they left the area.
And inside one set of overalls, there were the keys to a BMW. Those keys to the BMW led to the arrest of one man.
He was a greengrocer from the East London area.
While Lundy was interviewing the man, he gave up information about McKenny which really shocked Lundy, and Lundy found it difficult to actually take on board at first. He claimed that McKenny, with Childs, were committing contract killings.
So the man then delegated by Scotland Yard to pick up the reins of this inquiry was a very, very, again, successful and experienced detective, a chief superintendent called Frank Cater.
This case defined Frank Cater's career. It was the biggest case of his career, without a shadow of a doubt. Despite the fact he'd been involved with the Crays and the Richardsons, the John Childs Big H case really did define his career.
And together with his deputy, he was a man called Jeff Foxall, they took on Childs as an informant and essentially spent some weeks debriefing him.
Cater and Foxall were first interviewing Childs, who wasn't forthcoming to start off with in the slightest.
I'm Detective Chief Superintendent Cater.
The sort of questioning that Cater used would be, I know that you want to tell me something, I'm sure you want to tell me something, and it's only a matter of time before you will want to tell me something.
We hear you've been talking to your friends about some murders. Is that right? You and Big H. McKinney?
About what you're talking about?
That's not what we've heard.
What have you heard?
More than you think. About you, Big H, Pinfold.
Nah, you got nothing on me.
Terence, Teddy Bear Eve?
So it was very much cat and mouse sort of thing.
You might as well tell us. We know all about it.
John Childs may not have wanted people to find out that he had done the killings. He may have wanted to take control and say he had done the killings.
These were not the normal run-of-the-mill murders where a murder takes place, a body is found, and then the police begin an investigation.
But what actually...
Essentially, Childs was telling them about murders, a number of murders they didn't even know had taken place, where they didn't even know that the victims were missing, except in certain cases where they had been reported. But they had, very little starting point apart from what Childs was telling them.
The first murder allegedly took place in 1974.
Terry Eve had a little factory in a church hall in Hayden Road in Dagenham, where he manufactured teddy bears that he sold around pubs and clubs.
He was actually known to all his friends and associates as Teddy Bear Eve.
He let part of that factory out to Terry Pinfold and Henry McKinney.
Pinfold owned half of the teddy bear factory, but he wanted all of it, and unfortunately at that time Eve was not prepared to make the business over to him. What Pinfold apparently did, according to Childs, was he went to McKinney and said, Eve's a problem, I need to get rid of him. If I pay you, will you kill him? Towards the end of November in 1974, Eve walked in there one afternoon, completely unsuspecting, not knowing he was walking to his death.
It was said by Childs that McKinney and he lay in wait at the factory.
John Childs came along with his ball and peen hammer, piece of engineering equipment, which he said he got from when he was training as an engineer. John Childs claims that McKinney hit Eve with the wombleizer.
A piece of hose pipe which was filled with nuts and bolts. This continued until Eve was losing consciousness.
Just to make absolutely sure that, that Eve was dead, according to Childs, McKinney then strangled him until he was lifeless.
It was the most worst, gory, bloody, smelly murder I've seen. He was crying. What are you doing to me? What's happening? And Big H was hitting him with this lump of hydraulic hose and making a mess. Big H and me were covered in blood from head to toe.
But now the murder had been carried out, the blood that had been splattered in the factory was cleaned up.
The aftermath was very messy indeed, with blood running under the door, and they had to make sure that every part of the room and I think the corridor was washed down, and that took them all night after they committed the killing.
The body of Eve was taken to Childs' flat, 13 Dolphin House in Poplar.
McKinney and Childs had apparently done some pre-planning for the murder of Eve. They covered Childs' flat, this was in Dolphin House in Poplar.
Polythene sheeting was spread all over the floor.
So that no blood would seep into furniture or carpets or walls and so forth. They made it sort of, they hermetically sealed the flat.
At that point, we get the first allegation that comes out of the fantastical way in which the bodies were disposed of.
They had purchased a butcher's type industrial mincing machine, the sort that sausage factories would use for, mincing up, bulk quantities of meat. They decided to cut Eve's body up into manageable portions and then feed it through the mincing machine.
However, it was soon discovered that the power source for the mincing machine was not compatible with the domestic electricity supply in Charles' flat.
So that when they fed the first parts of Eve's body into it, the machine didn't have enough electricity coming in to make it work properly, and it jammed.
They then tried flushing some of the body parts down the toilet, and that didn't work either.
They actually blocked the lavatory a couple of times and had to try and clean it by hand. Faced with this, new problem, they decided, how else are we going to get rid of this body? This was an old council flat. It actually had an open grate fire in there. And according to Child, once they had the fire going, they cut Eve's body up into smaller portions, and over the next 16, 20, 24 hours, they were able to burn almost all of Terence Eve's remains on this very small fire grate inside the flat in Poplar. All they were left with at the end of it was a few portions of bone and other material that hadn't burnt very well.
There was some fragments of bone left over, so they basically crushed those up into powder.
And they were later disposed of by throwing them out of the window of a car which was speeding along Barking Bypass.
And when they returned, there was no trace of Eve whatsoever.
The next murder was a double murder.
Go on.
You don't want to hear what I have to say. You couldn't stomach it.
We hear you've been talking to your friends about some murders.
About what you're talking about?
You might as well tell us. We know all about it.
The first murder allegedly took place in 1974.
Terence Teddy Bear Eve?
It was the most worst, gory, bloody smelly murder I've seen.
In the peculiar warped minds of these men, their success at disposing of Eve actually gave them an idea for a business. How about we move out of armed robbery and into the contract killing business? We don't mind doing it. We know how to get rid of bodies.
I've met too many people with buried bodies. And they come up. We cut him up, get rid of him. Simple as that.
So they decided to go into business, both Charles and McKinney. They were going into business. They were killing people for money, using Terry Pinfold as the procurer.
George and Terry Brett. Remember them?
Childs claimed that in early 1975, McKinney and Childs were offered a contract to kill a haulage contractor called George Brett. Apparently what had happened was 2 years prior, in 1973, he'd been in a fight in a pub. During that fight, Brett had severely battered his opponent. The victim of this assault had never ever forgotten and had, what had happened to him, and had vowed that he would avenge this attack. And somewhere along the line, he became connected to Pinfold, and Pinfold said, listen, if we can agree a sum of money, I'll have these people, have this man murdered for you on your behalf, and he'll be disposed of. A great deal of planning went into what they did next. In fact, it was rather clever.
Charles dressed up as a man called Jennings. He assumed the name of Jennings. He dyed his beard.
He had a wispy, gingery, blonde beard at the time, but he dyed it black to disguise his facial appearance a bit. He got himself a trilby hat. He polished his shoes. He looked very smart and presentable when he turned up at Brett's address.
And he went to bring Brett to the factory in order to kill him.
What happened was that Charles went to Brett's farm in Upminster in Essex.
Hello. I'm Mr. Jennings.
And suggested a lucrative haulage contract to him.
Brett was suspicious about this deal he was being offered. Many detectives who investigated this case think that Brett thought, if I bring my little boy with me, nobody's going to do anything to me in the presence of a child. They're not going to, not going to hurt me. If they are setting me up, they're going to have to put things off. But if he thought that was the case, he was entirely wrong. When they got to the factory, at first everything seemed normal.
This is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
John Childs got one of these toys
One of Terry Eve's teddy bears that were left over.
and gave it to the boy, to Terry Brett, to play with for a moment. What was about to happen was truly terrible because, according to Childs, McKenny appeared with a silent Sten submachine gun, and without further ado, he shot George Brett through the head with it, killing him instantly.
Dad! Dad! Dad!
The little boy must have been absolutely traumatised by what he'd just seen, but what happened next, really, defies all kind of criminal codes.
Dad!
According to Childs, McKenny, then realising the boy was now, of course, a prime witness to what had happened to his father, put the gun to his head and dispatched him also. Childs was to say later that he was appalled by what had happened, that it caused a major falling out between him and McKenny. And he said, he said to the police when he was interviewed later that had he had a gun at that moment, he would have in fact shot McKenny. The bodies were put into the boot of a car and driven the few miles from Goodmayes to Childs' flat in Poplar.
Where once again they were dismembered, burnt on the fire in exactly the way that Eve's body had been disposed of. And then later the bones were ground up and they were disposed of as well.
The next killing was that of
Robert Brown, the White Angel.
Brown was also a well-known East London criminal, had been an associate of certainly McKenny's for some time. And in fact, shortly before 1974, Brown had been arrested by the police and successfully convicted for a number of burglaries. And he'd been sentenced to a jail term and been put in Chelmsford prison.
He escaped from Chelmsford prison and allegedly went to see Pinfold, who advised him that Childs would be the right man to take care of him, as indeed he was.
You were hiding him when he escaped from prison.
He saw us doing in Eve.
Apparently, McKenny said to Childs, we've murdered Eve, we've got rid of him, it was simple. Why take the chance? Brown's going to get caught again at some point. Inevitably the police are going to find him. He's a prison escaper. Who knows what he might say to the police to try and reduce his prison time? He might grass us up. So probably on the promise of somewhere else to hide out for a few days, the unsuspecting Brown was lured back to Childs' flat in Poplar.
I intended him to have 2 bullets in the back of the head. Bang. It's dead.
According to Childs, McKenny walked up behind him and shot him in the head at very close range. Brown was said to be as strong as a cart horse. He'd been a professional wrestler at one point in his life, and he certainly didn't die as easily as they wanted him to. Despite having a bullet in his head, his first reaction was to get up and fight back.
He got another bullet full in the face. He still wanted to fight. Well, Big H ran out the room with a gun and I was just left standing there. It was unbelievable. It was like a block of concrete.
They put him in the bath and they stuck every sharp object they could find into the man.
Virtually all his ornaments had been used to attack Brown with. And it was only eventually when they picked up a sword and thrust it through his heart that they were satisfied that he was actually dead. And over a period of a number of hours, they cut his body up into small, manageable portions and destroyed it on the fire. And in the end, there was no sign whatsoever that Brown had ever existed. The next murder that they carried out didn't take place until 1978.
Frederick Sherwood, nursing home proprietor.
Both Childs and McKinney allegedly were commissioned to kill this man.
By somebody who had a dispute with Sherwood and wanted him out of the way and was prepared to pay for him to be killed.
Last professional contract. Another job for Mr. Jennings. Well, Sherwood was selling his motor. I said I wanted to buy it. He drives it all the way over to Big H's. I'm there counting out the money. Big H shoots him in the back of the head.
Sherwood was put into the boot of his own car. He was driven to Child's flat in Poplar.
On this occasion, it took them 16 hours working in shifts for the body to be disposed of.
His last killing was described by him as the perfect kill.
The sixth victim was Ronald Andrews.
He was the last one.
Now, this wasn't a contract killing. Allegedly, McKinney was having an affair with Andrews' wife, Gwen.
Wasn't he Big H's friend?
So?
So, why kill him?
He died because Big H wanted his wife, his kids, his property.
This was unusual, and it wasn't a contract killing, but it was also a step away from their methodology previously, in that they rigged things to look like there'd been an accident.
A plot had been constructed to give the impression to any inquisitive person that on the night of the murder, Andrews would be going to Wisbeach in Cambridgeshire.
His wife received this postcard 3 weeks before he disappeared. Recognise the handwriting.
According to Childs, McKinney reasoned that Andrews would see this postcard that was sent to his wife and it would sow the seeds of doubts about his wife's fidelity in his mind. What then happened was that a message was got through to Andrews saying, if you want to try and find out, for a small, manageable sum of money, we could actually work on this case, find out who it is your wife is having an affair with.
That being done, Charles lured him back to his flat at Poplar.
He walked into the sterile zone without knowing what he was walking into. He sat down. I gave him a drink.
His fingerprints were now on the bottle of vodka.
According to Childs, McKinney appeared from out of nowhere, so as to speak, and shot Andrews dead.
The sound was minimal. He didn't even spill his drink on the carpet. It was absolutely perfect.
According to Childs, McKinney, who was dressed in a wetsuit, got into Andrews' car, together with the incriminating vodka bottle with his fingerprints on, and drove it all the way to Wisbeach.
The place where they'd sent the inflammatory postcard from to Andrews' wife.
It was said by Childs that McKinney drove the car straight into the River Nene.
When the car went into the water, McKinney was able to swim to safety and get out of the river, where Childs helped to pull him out.
Now, therefore, you had the car with the incriminating bottle of vodka in it, an open door, and anybody, hopefully, examining this would come to the conclusion that it had been Andrews who had driven the car into the river and had been lost by the strong currents.
Andrews was reported as missing Police accepted it, you know, without suspicion as a missing person report. Andrew's car remained in the river until it was eventually spotted by anglers.
Back at the flat, the usual ritual was observed with regards to the disposal of the body, and the two men took it in stages to supervise that this was done.
I got the impression the first killings were trial runs for how to be a contract killer and how to go about getting business and disposing of bodies. His last killing was described by him as the perfect kill.
While the police were debriefing Childs about the murders, McKenny was on the run.
Eventually, after many sightings, McKenny was tracked down to a masonette in Plaistow. He came out, he was arrested, and this was big news. This was big news. This was not just an armed robber being captured, but possibly a contract killer, possibly a serial killer, and the press, it really caught the press's imagination. Shortly after McKenny's arrest, Childs' trial came up.
His trial actually took place at the Old Bailey in 1979.
He pleaded guilty to the murders.
And asked for a couple of dozen other offences to be taken into consideration, all of them very serious offences.
He was only 2 days before the courts. You know, it was simply a case of, you know, basically running through the evidence that he'd given, and then he was sent to prison for the rest of his life. There were serious reporting restrictions on what the newspapers could say about Childs at that time, because, of course, most of what he had told the police about McKenny, you know, could not be put into the public domain.
A year after Childs had pleaded guilty, McKenny and Pinfold and 1 or 2 others came to trial. It was necessary for that gap of time for Cater to marshal all the evidence together in respect of this case.
And central to the evidence was this bizarre way that he disposed of the bodies. In order to see if this was possible, Frank Cater brought in a Home Office scientist.
A very respected pathologist named Professor James Cameron.
And the scientist brought with him a 12-stone pig, the equivalent weight of a grown man.
And what he did was to cut it up and put it on the fire in Childs' flat. And it worked, because within 13 hours, the pig's flesh had been completely consumed. So it proved the theory that human bodies could be burnt on that fire.
There was a couple of other pieces of evidence that were very, very slight indeed. There was some evidence of blood found in a couple of locations, but this was a blood type that was found in over 40% of the population, so it really didn't count for much. So really the entire trial hinged upon Childs' allegations.
When they did come to trial, and they all pleaded not guilty to everything, it was Childs who, of course, was the prime prosecution witness, because he stood up and gave evidence against them.
Pinfold and McKenny asked for a psychological assessment of Childs. This was turned down by his legal team, by Childs' legal team. However, Barry Irvin, who was a psychologist working at the Tavistock Institute at the time, observed Childs throughout the court case.
So what he came to argue was that Childs was suffering from psychopathy. Psychopathy is a type of personality disorder which is characterized by a lack of empathy, so low ability to empathize with how other people feel, and a number of other things like narcissism and lying.
His overall assessment was that Childs was a pathological liar, and that his evidence should not be accepted at all unless there was some kind of corroborative evidence.
It's not possible that this kind of assessment could be deemed admissible in a court setting, because it would have had to be admitted at the beginning of the trial, not towards the end after watching the court proceedings.
The judge did deem it to be inadmissible, and I can understand that as well, because it wasn't a proper evaluation of Charles' mental or psychological capabilities done in proper conditions. And McKinney and Pinfold were convicted of various aspects of the murder.
And sentenced to life imprisonment. When the sentence was passed, McKinney called the judge a hypocrite. He claimed that he was a lifesaver because of his work with valves, in developing valves for divers, and not a killer. And they went into they were sunk into the criminal justice system.
After McKinney and Pinfold were convicted of these various counts of murder, Childs contacted their respective legal people and said that he recanted his testimony and he would be able to get them out of prison, providing certain measures were taken with regards to him.
He claimed that he was promised by the police that he would only do a sentence of 8 years. His claims were based upon conversations that he alleged that he'd had with Cater, and promises that he alleged that Cater had made to him.
So Childs actually claimed that part of the interrogation process, he had been fed information about various crimes that had been suspected of occurring, missing individuals, and names were given to him over the course of the interview process, which he then ultimately claimed formed a foundation of a false confession.
The crimes that he claims to have committed are unproven.
It could well be that he had told a whole tissue of lies about them.
15 years later, Childs was to surface again, and I was actually to come face to face with him in the prison system.
In 1997, Childs contacted the Mirror newspaper, and he was subsequently interviewed by a Mirror journalist.
One day I was contacted out of the blue, really, by a woman who told me that she had essentially been writing to a number of convicted murderers and had become a pen friend with one of them in particular, who was a man called John Childs. She arranged for me to go with her to Long Lartin prison in Worcestershire to actually see Childs.
If someone says, "Do you kill people?" I say no. I don't kill. I don't murder people. I disappear them. Murder's crude. Brute strength without thinking. Now, I used to play chess. And the one thing I learned is when you move or don't move, you create circumstances. And the pattern changes. Disappearing people is smooth, slick, sensible. It's the thinking man's way.
Childs claimed there that he'd committed 5 additional murders.
I was walking along. I thought, I'm gonna have him, I'm gonna have him. There's a block of concrete. I picked it up and I threw it down at him.
Most of the time he was saying, "I can't remember what happened. I stuck a knife in him, he went down, I ran away." And I remember saying to him things like, "Well, you know, you're telling me that's a murder, but how do you know he was dead?" And he would say, "Well, he must have been. You know, I stabbed him in the heart. No one could have survived that." I thought he was making them up because he was struggling to kind of provide the detail and to talk consistently about what had happened.
I was with my black girlfriend, Joan. They followed us. Started making remarks. I was throbbing with hate.
These murders were investigated by Operation Rook, and the police found that there was no substance to them whatsoever, except for one murder which was committed in Lincolnshire, and it was the killing of a petrol station attendant.
He was an old boy. And when I think back, I feel sorry.
But the prosecution service rejected it because the evidence just wasn't strong enough.
At that time, I was willing to kill at a drop of a hat. Didn't bother me at all.
We have to ask why he would make these new confessions, why he would dream up these new crimes.
For an individual who is a diagnosed psychopath, or even just someone who's narcissistic and grandiose, it's possible that they might embellish what you might call their criminal CV by admitting to crimes that they never actually committed. And they might also embellish the stories, the severity. They might add details about fetishes, about very dramatic situations that never actually happened, just to sensationalize and make themselves seem more of a criminal.
There is a possibility that he wanted to, get back into the, into the limelight again in 1997.
I felt super keyed up, super fit, super tight, indestructible, extremely powerful, bulletproof, invincible.
Perhaps the final twist in this tale came in 2003 after both Pinfold and McKenny lodged appeals against their convictions on the grounds that they'd been unsafe, in that essentially that the evidence against them had been unreliable.
There was evidence presented by James Harrison Griffiths, a police officer who 23 years earlier had been investigating the disappearance of Terry Eve, and he claimed that he'd been told by Commander Burt Wickstead to leave this investigation alone because Terry Eve was actually living in an assumed identity in South London.
They asked me about why I stopped the inquiry and why the inquiry was paused, and I told them about Mr. Wickstead telling me to stop it, and mentioning the fact that I was told if I wanted to be a detective, I had to leave it alone.
Also called into question was the actual murder of the Bretts. George Brett's brother had been involved in giving evidence against the Tibbs family some years earlier, and there was a suggestion that his disappearance could be involved in that. There was also sightings, there had been reported sightings of George Brett, so the killing of George Brett was not clear-cut at all. A cornerstone of this appeal was the evidence that was presented at the original trial by Barry Irving, which had been deemed inadmissible at the time.
It was accepted that at the time that he gave his evidence to the police and later gave evidence against them at their trial, that Childs was suffering from a serious personality disorder that rendered anything he might have said at the time that helped to convict them to be unsound.
Dr. Sumac actually drafted up another psychological profile, which was part of the appeal process, and it overlapped with Irving's original assessments. So both professional opinions stated that psychopathy was a major factor, that narcissism was involved, that pathological lying with similar features characterized this individual.
And the courts of appeal agreed with that new evidence, essentially. And both McKenny and Pinfold were formally declared innocent of the crimes for which they'd already served, 20 years in jail.
The final twist in the tale is that in 2014, Childs sought the right to appeal against his sentence.
One of the things that Childs said in his petition was that Cater and his team fed words into his mouth, and he has simply agreed with them, and also that he would receive a much reduced sentence instead of the whole life tariff which he eventually got.
If he's going to confess to 6 murders, there was no way that Cater could say, you'll only get 8 years for this if you cooperate. He was bound to get a life sentence. The police couldn't do anything about it, the courts couldn't do anything about it. That's the statute. You go to prison for life for a murder. And clearly, for 6 murders, they're going to give you a minimum term as well. So, he either misheard that, he made it up, or he was very stupid if he believed that.
As part of the appeal process, Childs' lawyers employed 4 psychologists who all made assessments, psychological profiles of Childs.
I was sitting there, wearing a pair of jeans, double knotted my trainers so they wouldn't come off if there was a fight. I was wearing my leather driver's jacket, zipped up nice and tight, so nothing too loose. I felt good. Fit, compact. I had my gloves on, I had my hammer, and I just sat there, adrenaline pumping through me. I was sweating like a pig.
And what they seemed to all agree on was that Childs did in fact have antisocial personality disorder. He was a pathological liar, and he was narcissistic, and he had a history of just deceiving individuals.
I can't imagine killers not having some sort of psychopathic disorder, some antisocial behaviour, otherwise people wouldn't kill.
However, what they didn't agree on was whether or not these murders that he had confessed to were false confessions or not.
And it was decided in the end that although he was indeed a compulsive and pathological liar, that he was sufficiently in control not to send himself down for life.
Based on these 4 profiles that the psychologists provided, Childs' appeal was actually turned down. They did not confirm that Childs had certainly falsely confessed. They said, yes, he had a personality disorder, but most of them did not agree that it had been a false confession.
It means this man, this infirm man in his 80s, will spend the rest of his life in prison, possibly based on lies that he told about himself.
He's always served his time in the prison system. He's never been in Broadmoor or a psychiatric hospital. But you have to say that anybody who's capable of such, cold-blooded murder and then, dismembering, just think about the gory scenes that must have taken place in that flat in Poplar. Anybody who's capable of committing those acts must be psychologically disturbed, are they not?
Quite possibly the only man that knows the real truth about what happened is someone who's been defined and accepted as being a pathological liar.
So for John Childs, it's possible that over time, his confession, his statement, his memory has changed so many times that he doesn't actually know what originally happened, if anything happened at all.
Who knows what's going on in his mind right now?